welcome to all of you gathered here under perhaps even a little further than the usual, just the other side of intimacy, as Leonard Cohen says in the Live in London album. Welcome to Readercon's panel, Get Along Little Hippos, Writing the New Wilder West. I am your host and moderator, Max Gladstone. I am the co-author of This Is How You Lose the Time More, which I was told to actually show on screen as opposed to just vaguely gesturing at the bookcase behind me, and Empress of Forever, which is a, I don't know, weird journey to the Western, I guess, in a sense, and a number of other books. And I am going to be moderating and facilitating the conversation. As we get started and introduce ourselves, I'm hoping that those of you who are watching, especially since this is such a rich topic, there's a lot to be said here, and there are a lot of directions this conversation could go. I'm hoping some of those of you who are watching can slide into the Discord and ask any questions up front, or any subjects that you'd really like to see this particular group of panelists dive into. I'm not going to promise ahead of time that we'll get to everything, because huge topic, but that'll help us guide our conversation. Then we'll open up for direct questions about 10 minutes before the end of the panel. So as we do that, we'll go ahead and start introductions. Let's see. Darcy, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, Max. I'm Darcy Little Badger, and I have a PhD in oceanography, but I'm now a full-time writer. So my first book, Alatsoi, yeah, I know it's the first year of that. It's been exciting and kind of interesting. Alatsoi was published in 2020, and it's now, it won the Locus Award, not finalist for Andre Norden. There's a Lodestar coming up, and I'm just so grateful for that reception that it's received from everyone. So my second book is coming out in November, and it's called The Snake Falls to Earth. And yeah, I'm interested to talk about this subject with everyone, particularly because I am Lipon Apache, and the Apache people tend to appear in a lot of Westerns. As we introduce ourselves, on my maternal line, or my mother's side, I'm from the Little Breechcloth Band. On my father's side, I'm Irish. So yeah, just great to be here.
Wonderful. So pleased to have you here. I see Jean-Louis Trudel. I'm kind of going around clockwise on my screen, which may or may not resemble anything that anybody else sees.
Hello. So very glad to be back at Readercon after many years. I write science fiction, fantasy in French, and sometimes in English for many years now, since before Readercon existed. We were often told to write what we know, and the paradox that kind of attracted me to this panel was that one thing I know about is my family's Western history that stretches back to, well, at least the 18th century in terms of recorded events. And yet I've never written about that Western history involving basically some of my Métis ancestors. And so I'll leave it at that and see where the questions lead.
Fantastic. And I see Nikhil next.
Hi, I'm Nikhil Singh. I'm a South African novelist. I'm in South Africa right now. I have a book out this year called Club Dead, DED, from Luna Books, which was shortlisted for the British Science Fiction Association Award and the Normos. And I've got a story in the new Out of the Ruins anthology from Titan Book, Malware Park. And I had a story in the recent Holland Ellison tribute as well. I'm just really obsessed with Westerns. I've been obsessed with Westerns pretty much my whole life. So it's quite nice to talk about it. That's all.
Excellent. And then Jess. Are you there, Jess?
Hi, my name is Jess Nevins. By day, I'm a college library director in. Can you hear me?
You're sort of breaking up a little bit. Sorry, Jess.
Day, I'm a college library director, and by night, I write nonfiction.
Oh no. All right. Well, hopefully we'll get Jess back.
How about now?
What? I can hear you now. Yes, that's clear.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jess Nevins. I'm a college library director by day, and by night I write reference books. I wrote a history of 20th century horror fiction called Horror Fiction in the 20th Century that got named one of the 10 best reference books of the year by the American Library Association. And I'm currently finishing up an encyclopedia of pulp heroes, for which I read, among other things, and a horrible number of Western stories in the pulp magazines. And
Oh,
I've
wonderful.
read Westerns all my life, but this was something else entirely.
Excellent. And that I just remembered as just dropped off my screen here that I should have, as you're going around and introducing, asking everybody to say pronouns as they're using. I use he, him, he series pronouns. If everyone wouldn't mind chiming in with theirs.
Sure, I'm she, her.
He, him for me.
I'm he, him.
It's Jess.
I'm he, him.
Excellent. All right. And Nikhil, I'm sorry I didn't hear yours. If
I'm from the planet Venus. We don't really have bodies there. So,
okay, fantastic. All right. Well, remarkably good reception from Venus. Fantastic. All right. So I'll start off by reading the panel description. We're getting some comments and questions coming in through the chat, and then let's dive into it. Get along, little hippos. Recent speculative stories set in the 19th century American West have updated the Western's romanticized images of exploration and first contact with a nuanced understanding of the history and perspectives that traditional Westerns erase. But the more real pain appears in these stories, the further they get from pulpy adventure fun. How can authors defy the harmful conventions of the past while still giving readers what they want from a Western? So there's a lot to get into in that panel description. I see three major questions that I'd love us to tackle. First, sort of to what extent have recent weird Westerns updated the genre of the weird Western? Does this trend exist as an overall thing? Is it a question of multiple sort of trends operating side by side? And then there's this sort of third, I guess, of the question, which is this dichotomy it's setting up between real pain and pulpy fun, which we might want to talk about. Like, to what extent are those things really at odds? Is it a case of different narrative trends sort of mutually reinforcing each other, or narrative techniques? And in the end, sort of, can we have pulp, and maybe we should even talk a little bit about what pulp is in that case, and honest history side by side. I'd love to start, before we get into the deep stuff though, by talking about our own experience with Westerns. Like what does Western, or especially a weird Western, mean for each of us? Are there a couple of core texts that we think about, or do we have a general impression? I raise this because the Western specifically is this sort of palimpsest genre. It gets layered over, and the first texts that you encounter may not have anything to do with sort of the deep genre history. Jess mentioned deep pulp, and I haven't gone there at all. I've never read the old pulp Westerns. The closest to the deep pulp, like Western magazines, that I've ever read are Louis L'Amour novels, which are in some ways responding to and kicking back against some of that stuff, even in a gentle way. For me, the canonical Western is probably Lonesome Dove, which is like very late in the way of thinking about Westerns. So that's a little bit about my experience and perspective. Anybody else want to dive in?
Yeah, I can go because I have a kind of interesting answer in that I kind of avoid them like in a
Sure.
major way because it's very uncomfortable for me to read or watch a lot of these. But in the few instances when I've been kind of like tricked into watching a weird Western, I'm thinking how I got really into Firefly for a long time, which has those Western themes in space and a whole lot of stuff. Of course, then I heard that the Reavers were based on Apache people, so that wasn't so fun.
Yeah.
But I really enjoy that. So I feel like there's elements of these Westerns that personally I would really enjoy. But so far, just the fact that even in more sympathetic takes on Native people, we tend to be side characters, we tend to be tragic. I mean, I want to read a Western that's just all Native main characters. I'm getting married to my fiance's Navajo. What about an Apache young woman in the 1800s meets a Navajo young woman and they go off and have adventures? I would love to see that. And the fact is, it's a shame that I just feel so uncomfortable every time I run into these. It's just I can't enjoy them, and I'd really like to. So that's something that I hope that in the future I'm going to be able to encounter more Westerns, maybe even written by Native people, or that center our experience, but give us that chance to have this pulpy, fun adventure. Because I also don't like reading about tragedies in the 1800s involving, because I'm very well versed in my own history. Basically, I know my whole family line on my mother's side, and I know what happened to us in Texas. We actually, in the 1800s, that was a very difficult period for us, because that's when this federal Indian removal really kicked into high speed. There were bounties on our head. People from both Mexico and the United States were trying to kill us. And I just hate reading that in my pulpy fun fiction. So my answer is I have not yet, because I'm so afraid to kind of dip my toes into this, because I just hate to get burned during my escapism. Free time is so scarce these days. So that's my answer.
It's fair.
Well, if I may, I'm not a great reader of Westerns, but when I was younger, I did read a lot of Louis L'Amour. And I've also kind of looked, and back then I also once tried a Zane Grey, so there we're talking probably deep pulp, and didn't find it to my liking. I've also read, and back in my youth, an abridged version, I think it was, of Karl May's Western. So there you have the Western tradition beyond the U.S. border, and does feature Apaches, I believe, with this particular, of course, 19th century German version or vision, I should say. But in recent years, while I've seen perhaps a few movies, my interests have been elsewhere. And fairly early, when I was past, you could say, the Louis L'Amour stage, and got interested in just the family history, I was more interested in kind of reading the history of the Métis, Louis Riel, and some of that Canadian history, which overlaps with the U.S. border, because the border didn't necessarily mean much in the first half of the 19th century anyway.
Sure. Nikhil, then I see you next on my screen.
Yeah.
May I?
Oh,
Well, go,
sorry,
go
Jess,
ahead.
did you want to build on top of that?
I'll go after you. Fine.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. For me, it's the thematic thing about the Westerns that I enjoy so much. So, I started off with more cinema, but I moved into Jonathan Raban wrote a really interesting book called Hunting Mr. Heartbreak, where he goes into how a lot of the West was created out of the pulp fiction that was circulated with advertising brochures around the West, and how it's actually a sort of fictitious thing. And for me, the other thing that really amazes me is how the beginnings of Hollywood are so fused with this notion of the West as a thing. Because Hollywood actually started in New York on rooftops. That's where they started. Cowboy movies were quite a thing at the time. But for me, for the weird Western thing is definitely J.R. Lansdale, The Drive-In Part 2, and Across Cadillac Desert with Dead Folks. Because the Western for me, I grew up in a police state under apartheid. So the politics and stuff, I sort of gloss over it because I'm so used to it. So for me, the Western is a thematic thing. It's like a person, the wasteland, a town, and it's these tropes, and why these tropes keep popping up, and there's sort of the Jungian significance is more interesting because I think you can transplant them anywhere. I don't really even associate them with the American West. They exist in the sort of fantasy, reality, which never really existed, and that's for me is quite fascinating that it's endured for so long. So I read, I'll read history, and then I'll look at Westerns, and never the twain shall really meet. So that's where I stand.
That's a great point. It brings to mind the spaghetti Western, the sort
exactly.
of the dream state that something like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly feels like it inhabits. You can't map it onto any American geography or any period of history. And then Jess?
I was first exposed to the Western through Saturday afternoon movies and then running across Owen Wister's The Virginian, which is this sort of capstone text for all Western fiction that followed. It wasn't until I loved it as a kid, but when I read it 30 years later as an adult, I realized how deeply subversive it is toward the Western tradition. It's essentially a big gay Western, though the word is never spoken. And it's all about masculinity and performative masculinity versus the real thing. And the history of the Western is this sort of lesson in how editors and publishers tamed down the unruly parts of it and made it into the cliche we know it is today. If you look at the old pulp stories, most of them are full of the usual tropes and cliches and plot dynamics we know so well. But every so often you find something like the shooting gallery kid, who's this Chinese cowboy out of San Francisco who is just out in the West for no good reason and doing the cowboy thing. The pulps had stories of Native American heroes who were portrayed. The intention was good, at least. The execution, not so much. But there was a real attempt to sort of diversify the West before the editorial hammers came down. Anyway, The Virginian was my first exposure. As for Weird Western, I think River of Teeth is my current favorite.
Excellent. Yeah, so great texts being mentioned here. I mean, River of Teeth is almost explicitly name checked, if not, I don't know, sort of name semaphored in the panel description. And of course, you got some other texts that just sprang to mind. Gailey's also written Upright Women Wanted. There's Karen Memory. Nicole mentioned Lansdale, The Gunslinger, Stephen King's series, which is, again, very explicitly set in this sort of Dream West, aggressive drive off and kind of off the cliff. And then, of course, I think it's appropriate, and then Firefly, Darcy mentioned, obviously. I mean, we could have a whole convention about Firefly. Firefly, the show, which, like, I do have this deep affection for also, and yet I remember being the only Southerner at my Northern college watching that when it was coming out with a bunch of, well, not the only Southerner, but the only Southerner in this group of people who are watching it and being like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And it's like, you realize that they're the Confederates, right? Like, you realize that's the brown coat thing, that you're getting to do that without actually, I don't know how I feel about this. So, small version, but it's strange that how creating that dream in some ways allows you to ignore the reality, but then the dream is also I don't know, a vital force in like the way that we attempt to understand ourselves. I guess who's the we? Anyway, going in a lot of different directions there. I'm sorry. So, oh, the one thing that I wanted to bring up in addition to that general list, and we can of course add to it, is the fact that an early issue solicitation ad for Analog magazine, like way back in the beginning of the pulp science fiction genre, was talking specifically about how Analog did not want to publish space westerns. That is to say, pulp westerns with the serial numbers and identifying details filed off so that you're like, you know, your space ranger is waiting in an asteroid field to, you know, attack the people who are coming through the bandits who are coming through the asteroid field, who've been raiding caravans and so on and so forth. That like you just find and replace all of the covered wagons with spaceships and you know, all the 6 guns with ray pistols, and then you have a new storyline which speaks, regardless of what Analog was trying to do, to a trend of like Western storytelling that is throughout pulp science fiction also, and I think continues to this day, even in things that don't have where you don't have like hats and horses, like maybe Damnation Alley is a good example of the individual, the town, the wasteland, as Nikhil was saying.
Damnation Alley is definitely one of my favorites as well.
Yeah, it's great. So do we feel so a lot of these texts that people have mentioned do like River of Teeth or Care of Memory do feel like they're doing some work of trying to pull real history, or at least a different angle on real history, into this popular imaginary of the West that feels very, I don't know, Clint Eastwood. But it, you know, I also look at weird westerns or genre westerns, and it's also in the last 20 years that Cowboys and Aliens came out. We've got Firefly being a sort of troubled text in a few different ways. I don't know. Do we think that this really has there has been a sea change in science fictional or fantastical depictions of the West, or the imaginary of the West? Open question. Jess has raised their hand. Yes, thank you, Jess. Sorry.
I would say that there is a sea change, because you can see it in mainstream westerns like Mary Doria Russell's Dock and C. Pam Zhang's How Much of These Hills is Gold and Colin Winnett's Hain't Stay. These are all mainstream books that are overtly Western and are yet deeply revisionist in a variety of ways. There's always going to be the standard cliched westerns, but more and more on the bookshelves you can find these sort of expanded westerns, whether are revisionist westerns, whether weird or non-genre, if you will.
That's a great point. Maybe another way to expand that question a little bit. Oh, Jean-Louis?
Well, perhaps up here in Canada, you have a slightly, of course, different relationship to the quote unquote Western, because Canada had its own West. And I think that one part of the evolution in recent years, especially if you want to kind of drag in something weird about it, is that Indigenous futurism has risen as a category. And in a sense, sometimes they will kind of recreate past eras as well as present eras. And I've seen this somewhat in English and even somewhat in French out of Manitoba. And so one part of, you could say, the rewriting of of the West has been the rise of indigenous voices presenting their own vision of things and own realities. I recently read this year. We had in Canada the first anthology of Indigenous futurism in French. I think from memory, almost all, if not all, of the authors were from the province of Quebec, so none from the West per se. But it is a possibility that perhaps will come to the fore later on.
That's fantastic. Just want to give people an opportunity to jump on that if anyone has anything.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking, I'm not sure about evolution. Like, I do think that there are some pretty exciting, like, I need to read that, The River of Teeth. Is that the duology? How you?
Yeah, I think that's the name of the first one, and I forget if they
Okay.
were published under a separate name as one volume. It's a lot of fun. There are
Yeah,
a lot of
that's
hippos.
something.
A lot of
Yeah,
hippos.
it's on my TBR for like the past 2 years, and I really need to read it because it sounds really, really cool. And it is like an alternate history, and that's something I think would be because it really is. It's these themes, and these themes, like for example, of the lone gun person, going out and saving a kind of like little ghost town and stuff like that. Things like that, I think, really transplant well into alternate envisionings, either of history or just like whole new worlds. I do love, Westerns in space. Like technically that's not the West anywhere, it's in space, but just transplanting those themes, I think, is really cool. And yeah, so I unfortunately can't say much to the evolution because I haven't read a lot of the older stuff, but I think that the future is bright.
I think there's one interesting parallel with what's been going on from an African perspective is you see a lot of like African-based speculative stuff coming in from the West, where there is like a confrontation with a natural space, whereas the more indigenous-based literature, it's already harmonized with the space. So you don't have this like there's the thing of entering like a dangerous area, and you have to like there's some danger. It's more like, oh, we're already here, so like the stories become more cellular around the community. And I find that's actually like quite a big schism that probably translates to this. Is like people come in expecting certain tropes where they're like, oh, we want this movement into the unknown, whereas if you're indigenous and you've been there, it's not really the unknown, so it subverts the trope right from the beginning. And I think that's bleeding through in all sorts of different ways, which is just very interesting. Yeah, I like it.
I got to say, I really do resonate with that because a lot of these stories take place like in these deserts environments. And we just like, for example, in my kitchen right now, we were just passing like this cactus on the side of the road and just saw a bunch of cool fruit and we just gather it up. So it's being prepared in the kitchen. But like when me and my fiance go out to the desert, we sometimes just do that just to relax. We're always trying to one up each other on finding ways like, oh, there's an edible plant, or that's where we'd find water. And I was thinking really cool. It would be like, it really isn't that kind of deadly environment that a lot of these more pulpy Westerns portray it as, with like the skeletons and the buzzards flying around and stuff. If you know how to live in these arid environments, it is home. And that would be a cool angle. Like what about like just a small group of people living in the desert and they're like all happy and stuff, and maybe they have to save the day somehow. I don't know, but yeah, I definitely resonate with that. It's not as it's not even like it's just not the type of, because it's almost like sometimes the environment itself plays a sort of antagonist because these people are trying to survive in a place with very little water, and they don't know what to eat and they don't know where to go. There's very few other people around. And that antagonism is completely removed when you actually, that's your home, it's your homeland, it's the desert. But yeah, that's a really good point.
It'd be interesting almost to flip the script a little bit. I'm thinking of books like Little Big, where the city is explicitly like reconstructed as the forest from like a German fairy tale. It's the place where you go to have adventures and great danger. So you could have somebody who's totally at home in the desert and is like, oh, this is great. This is fantastic. I know where to find water. I know what you eat. I have this great community, and now I need to go over here, and this is weird. This like the buildings and I don't know.
That's me every time I go to New York City. Like it's really cool, but also very intimidating. I'm like, oh, how do you survive? There's so many things around.
What you were saying about edible plants reminded me of this book, The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Heinrich, which is a novel about, not a novel, I'm sorry, just novels on the brain right now. It's a book about culture and evolution and the sort of the author's a scientist. His main argument ends up being that humans are extremely well evolved to pass along cultures, and almost better evolved to do that than anything else. Like it's not abstract reasoning that we're extremely better at than apes. We're much better than apes at learning from each other. It's a pretty cool point. You know, a lot of it's social science research. So I find myself, whenever I read a book like this, asking how much of it has passed the reproducibility crisis and so on and so forth. But there's a wonderful chapter, which is just a survey of European explorers getting lost and like starving to death in desolate wildernesses where there was an existing indigenous community that was doing extremely fine, like literally 2 miles away. And often these people were like showing up and giving the Europeans food and like, you know, hey, so these stories are introduced to counter the argument that like humans are just naturally good at surviving in unfamiliar territories. No, human beings are extremely good at remembering what you need to do to survive in spaces. But if you just drop a human in an unfamiliar zone, like we die pretty quick. So yeah, this question of familiarity then and unfamiliarity seems one that's really live. And let's talk a little bit about weird in that case, the weird in weird Western. Like what work does that do? Is it what is it just a way to have like cool magic spells and robots? Is it it can be a path into the dream space, like weird as a sort of gateway to magic also? What compels us to seek out the weirdness in a Western narrative? Or even if we're somebody like Sergio Leone and we're not literally putting aliens in New Mexico, I guess any more aliens than like white people are in New Mexico, I guess. If we're not, using traditional, what we'd think of as science fiction or fantastical genre architecture to nevertheless say, oh, I'm going to do a Western, but it's not going to have anything to do with the actual West beyond these strong images. Does that make sense?
William Burroughs, Place of Dead Roads. Yeah, he did that. But I thought what he did was actually very interesting because it's this notion of, Americana from an outside perspective, which is like a transplanted, society. And the Place of Dead Roads, the actual theme of the book was, when you have your road that you walk to your house or to your school, but then you leave and it becomes a dead road that only exists in your dreaming. And he transposed this entire concept into the concept of the West, that it's a place of dead roads, which I thought was really interesting because that's why J.R. Lansdale, he could do things like transplant, use thinned Cadillacs instead of horses. And it still works because you're still within your thematic thing. And that's how there were so many neo-noir thrillers in the 90s that were basically Western. You've got the car heading out on the highway, gas station in the middle of nowhere. It's this continuation of like a movement. I mean, I think it was Gore Vidal, he was talking about how, the only real setting for American fiction was Huckleberry Finn because it was moving down a road or they were moving down a river. And it's that constant movement towards something, which Lansdale also, like, he kind of made fun of in The Drive-In. They were going down a road and right at the end it was covered by razor celluloid, but they couldn't escape. It kept slicing them, so they had to move back. I think the weird has to stay within the confines of the dream, Otherwise, it doesn't, become that anymore, which is an exploration into the unknown.
Bringing in a comment that somebody on Discord raised earlier, that somebody once said that the Old West is like the Second World War in terms of American myth building, and that the total screen time of all films and TV shows devoted to that era far exceeds the actual historical era that we're talking about. Jean-Louis?
Couple of answers, perhaps, to your question. One thing that strikes me is that, and this is from the point of view of somebody who's kind of outside the U.S. and outside the culture to some point, is that the subject of perhaps even these weird Westerns, say Cowboys versus Aliens, is perhaps not so much the West as the Western itself, because they're basically kind of just playing with these pulp conventions. And here's a Dr. Who. Dr. Who had a weird Western episode with, I think it was Muffet. And so you have, and I'm also thinking.
And it's very structurally Western, like in that, he rides to town on a mysterious blue horse, and he's got a thing in his holster that he can pull out and solve some problems. Nobody knows who he is, the man with no name.
Absolutely. No name at all. And I'm also here in Quebec. There's a series of graphic novels called Far Out, which are basically Westerns with robots. Pretty much all the characters are robots. There are very few humans. Maybe even the horses are robots. I'm not quite sure about that. And the title itself is, of course, a kind of translinguistic wordplay, because it also refers to the idea of the Far West, which is how, in French, the Western is very deeply associated with that. The English term has become a loan word in French, but I feel that there's the weird Western has. One can also turn towards, as that, some of the production, some of the writings or imagined of the indigenous peoples. And personally, I'm of course interested in the Métis people. And one of the things that is kind of on my list of possible projects is the fact that this Métis leader of the 19th century, who led a rebellion in the 1885, and before that, there's a long history there, which eventually was crushed by the Canadian Army. One of two occasions on which the Canadian Army was deployed against Indigenous peoples in Canada, in force anyway. He was a utopian. He actually wrote, you could even say, yeah, he actually wrote a kind of utopian vision, which involved basically setting up a state that would be a kind of, whose official religion would be a Christian heresy, and which would host, and he was writing this in the 1880s, Catholic refugees from around the world. He was in the West, in the Canadian West, and he was kind of arguing that in the same way that the indigenous peoples of the West had become the parents of the Métis by mixing with the French and the Scottish fur traders, this future state could be a kind of a new kind of ex-Catholic utopia open to persecuted Catholic minorities from around the world. And I'm still thinking about what I could do with that in terms of fiction. But if you go back to the actual people of the West and the actual history of the West, there are things that could be very weird and somewhat also very authentic.
I really like that point, Jean-Louis, about how really we're dealing with two distinct questions here. There's the dream and the actual history. And the dream is in some ways a lot more familiar to us than the actuality. A lot more familiar to many of us than the actuality, because the dream is what's projected on screens and rebooted every 5 years and has a recognizable iconography that anchors upon it. But there's, I don't know, less of a commercial promotion industry in what was actually going on. who was actually out there trying to survive, and make a community for themselves, utopian or just like, I don't know, staying one step ahead. That really feels like the core tension that we're dealing with here, whether we're talking about pulp or weird Western, between actuality and dream space. We've had a couple of questions that we could, 10-minute warning, that I'd like to touch on, both about sort of appropriation and erasure. I guess I could sum up as, when we're trying to write something using this material, either on the real side or on the dream side, how to, if we're engaging with dream, how to do so in a way that does not allow the dream to erase real experience, or that has some respect for real experience, or on the historical side, I don't know how to proceed respectfully. I'm not sure if maybe there's a vague question in there, but I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Yeah, and I guess it goes to the wider question that as writers, you kind of wonder, like, if you're writing outside of your culture, how to do so respectfully. And I think that applies to this question as well. Is because if this is specifically about like the indigenous peoples, and you're trying to write a weird history that uses real groups, I just do your research, and also I tend to say, write a story with these folks as characters, but don't necessarily try to write a story about what it's like to be, for example, an Apache person, unless you really feel like you're well suited to do that. But you could write a story about a character who's Apache, who is like, I don't know, riding a hippo. Like, I don't see any issue with that personally. I think it'd be fun to read. And I think that the issue comes in with these reimaginings. For example, I mentioned how the Reavers, who are these just like mindless killing machine monster cannibals, were based on Apache people. And I think that just being aware that there are these harmful tropes and trying to avoid putting those tropes in a roundabout way into your reimaginings might be helpful. But yeah, it's one of those like complex questions. And even I sometimes wonder how to respectfully write about my own culture. It's hard to get away with that when you're writing about underrepresented people, and it's hard work. But yeah, I'd love to read about more like fun hippo adventures. So it's not something to dissuade people to representing the full complexity of this period in terms of not just Native people, but I think a commenter mentioned there were Black people out, in the West, and that's not as commonly represented as like that. So, for example, I think Max, you mentioned how most cowboys in fiction tend to be like white guys, but that wasn't really the reality of it. Cowboys come in all varieties of people, So.
Something I really liked about Elizabeth Bear's Care and Memory was sort of resurfacing the history that the Lone Ranger as a historical character was based on a Black Texas Marshal. Not definitely the way the character tends to get portrayed, but yeah, that is the historical foundation for it. There was one question about the young adult novel Sing Down the Moon by Scott Odell. It sort of amounts to whether or not it holds up. I'm wondering if anyone's read that. I have to confess I haven't.
No. I think it's about the Trail of Tears. I do know that a recent book came out, Mary and the Trail of Tears by Andrea Rogers. And that one, I think if you're looking for reading material for kids, that would be a good one. But I can't actually speak to the Sing Down the Moon because I haven't read it. I'm sorry.
And we've only got a few minutes left. Does anyone have a specific question? Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just thinking of that S.P. Sonto novel, Moondance, which you read in the 80s, which is quite interesting because he was writing about werewolf myths in the native, but also werewolf myths in the French and German people coming, and how they had a culture clash as werewolves, and he read it really well. He very well researched, and he was Indonesian, so but it's another weird Western book that I really thought was quite nice. Moon Dance, S.B. Sansberg.
That's great.
Oh, you know what
So
else is really weird? Before we just go, is also that
Mhm.
Wyatt Earp died in Los Angeles in a
Yes.
hotel room.
Oh God. To
That's
your
the
point
weirdest
about
Western
Hollywood.
of all. Yeah.
Moon Dogs. I want to write that down. That sounds
Moon Dawn.
very,
Moon Dawn.
very much up
Dawn.
my alley. Thank you. Does anyone have out there in Discord land, the Discord of which we are all a constant screaming part these days, have any further questions? Not seeing any filtering in, but in the meantime, with our 5 remaining minutes, why don't we go around? I'd love to hear any of the panelists say either any last words or just where can we find more from you online or in the world, or do you have any books that are coming out soon that people can go look for?
I just want to thank the panelists for, I have a few new books to put on my reading list now, and I feel like I'm less afraid to delve into this, because like the Western stories, just there's something that's very magnetic about them. So I'm looking forward to trying some out. And yeah, my next book is coming this November, A Snake Falls to Earth. It's a fantasy, takes place in 2 worlds, the near future Earth and this land of like spirits and monsters, and it's just based on Lippon Apache storytelling structures. So that should be interesting to see how everyone receives that. And thank you again.
Yeah. Nikhil, I see you next on my screen.
Yes, thanks to everyone. It's very nice to chat to you all. My book, Club Dead, DED, from Luna Publishing is out now. It's like an Afrofuturist shortlisted book. I've also got a story coming out in an anthology from Titan next month called Out of the Ruins. I'm quite proud of. And that's it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Jean-Louis?
I guess my next publications in English include a poem in a small environmental Canadian magazine called Little Blue Marble. And there's a story that should be coming out in a Mars anthology out of from Wilder Press. I'm kidding. I've got that right. Which is a translation of a prize-winning short story of mine. And I'm just trying to remember the title. It's especially in English. I think it became in English To Cage a Phoenix. And for anybody reading French, I will always recommend my book on Quebec science fiction, available for online, of course.
Excellent. And Jess?
I probably should have plugged this at the start. I self-published via Amazon a collection of short stories about stagecoach Mary Fields, the toughest woman in Montana. It was me trying to write a revisionist Western using historical characters, and I think it's pretty good. My next publication is going to be in the Los Angeles Review of Books, a review of John Steinbeck's unpublished werewolf novel. Thank you all for attending.
Whoa.
And thanks for having
Speaking
me on
of
the panel.
werewolves. Fantastic. All right. Well, okay. Not seeing any further questions to dive in and getting the 1-minute warning, I think we've brought this whole thing home. Thanks, all panelists. It's been wonderful talking with you all, and this is such a cool subject for conversation, and there's a lot more depth here that we barely managed to scratch the surface, but it was a very cool surface scratching. I don't know if that makes any sense, but thanks so much for talking, and I hope that you out there in Discord have had a great time too. Wonderful to be here, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
I'm
Take
about
care.
to hop on a 36-hour train ride. All right, see
Oh
y'all later.
wow, excellent. Where are you
That's
going
why
to?
I'm wearing my hat. I'm going from San Marcos to Los Angeles to reunite with my fiance. I've been helping my mom. So anyway, that's why I got my travel hat on. Also, it was themed, but I'll see y'all
Yeah,
later.
no, bon voyage.
Thank you.
Have a great drive.
Bye.
Take it easy.
Thank you all. It was fun.